afternoon, everyone. During my youth, I got the immense opportunity to live in many different countries, all more unique than one another. In Benin, I felt a true sense of community. I also felt the dreadful drought. In Kentucky, I celebrated in front of a football game. I also celebrated the end of a hurricane. In Saskatchewan, I froze when I saw a deer in my backyard for the first time. I also froze when I was walking into school in minus 45 degrees. As the years go by, the joys of life are often accompanied by extreme climate events. Now the question is, do we change by design or by disaster? I truly believe we can change by design, and I know this panel will reinforce this idea today. In 2021 alone, Global Witness reported the tragic loss of 200 environmental defenders. That might seem like a small number compared to the wars that's going on, but that's about half of Butmi. So yes, half of you here dying for what you care to protect. Today, the panel on environmental defenders confronts a pivotal question. How can we protect the environmental activists committed to preserving our planet? To try and answer these challenging questions, we have the privilege today to welcome amazing guests. The environmental crisis cannot be addressed if those who are fighting against it are not heard. This was part of Michel Forst's statement for the COP28, a UN Special Rapporteur for Environmental Defenders. You have to raise your hand. Yes, exactly. We destroyed about 20% of the Amazon rainforest before we got serious about stopping deforestation. I hope we'll be quicker next time. Felix Finkbeiner, founder of Plan for the Planet, says this when talking about environmental defenders. Scientists are also environmental defenders that need to be heard and protected. This is what Salim Alim, student right now, tells me. I wanted to scream all the way from Germany to the Marshall Islands. Marshallese, can you hear me? There are people here all the way from Europe. They care. They truly care. Salim Alim mentions to the World Bank. Our panelists today represent a spectrum of expertise, experience, and perspective. Together, we aim to delve into the heart of the matter, understanding the challenge faced by young environmentalists and how we can find solutions to help them. Now, I'll pass it on to our moderator, Professor Shivsharan.
Thank you, Océanne. Lovely. Thank you. Let me use this. We have an amazing panel, but extremely limited time. And I'm a pretty tough taskmaster. So, nothing personal, but I'll just keep time. Okay, so what we have told the panel is each of the panelists will answer a series of questions. And the first question will come from me. And then hopefully the second question would come from within the panel. And after that, we'll open it up to all of you. And for the first question, the answers, they can take 5 full minutes. 5, right? For the second question, almost 3 whole minutes. After that, it's really up to them. Okay, so now the first question, which has been circulated, but not too, just I think a couple of hours ago, is drawing from the really excellent leadership panel we had this morning on passion and pragmatism. We often hear from successful leaders that youth should follow their heart, that they should disregard pragmatic concerns since that could limit what's possible. Instead, passion for change should be a single driving force. It could be for climate, for environment, for human rights, for political rights, for gendered rights, for change, right? Only in that way would the youth be able to triumph and overcome the considerable odds that life has a nasty way of putting in your way. Okay? But others take a different tack, including the leaders we heard this morning, right? The President Ramos Horta and Madame President Bachelet seem to have a slightly different approach, that youth should seek to balance passion for change while also being mindful or considering at the same time challenges in the practical realm of needing to prioritize and to pick your, quote unquote, pick your fights, of the importance of making alliances, even possibly with kind of like-minded people in order to advance your goals. So it's kind of a contrast to what the first lot would say, right? So what I'd like to have our amazing panel, each one of the panelists do, is to share your thoughts on this issue, drawing from your own life experiences, right? As to how you've gone about advancing. Each one of you has kind of advanced your passion in some way or the other. How have you kind of gone about, and give some hint to our fabulous audience how you've kind of gone about. So let's have that as the first question, and maybe Selina, you could start first, followed by Elena, then Felix, and Michel. All right, and now the clock starts ticking about now. All yours, Selina.
Okay, Olive. Thank you. Elaine Delina, mga to dyan ay lang kainar. Ibu mo lang na po imaron ko pa to ipemiwit. So firstly, want to thank all of you for coming in here today, especially for staying this long. It's been a lot of information, so we've been putting it out. So I'm really thankful that everybody is still here and then pushing through. To answer the question, I had started by when I was 15, and the bio it says when I was 13, but it was actually 15. And I'm not a scientist. I'm not academically inclined like that. But so I had started by writing letters to the newspaper in the Marshall Islands, the Journal. And so at 15, criticizing the Ministry of Education for the lack of attention they were giving to the schools and the inefficiencies of the school system and such, and how that was affecting myself coming from a low-income family. That letter was then put into the front page of the Journal, which caused immense uproar within the country as a nation whose culture focuses on the elders being the decision makers and youth voices not being discouraged from these spaces. A lot of elders were upset with the tone and the things that I was addressing, especially to my elders, and so my family were very fearful of our safety. I had many arguments with my parents, them not supporting the things that I was doing, because a conversation I had with my mother, she sat me down and she was asking me earnestly, Selina, are you not scared? These are politicians and traditional leaders you are addressing very aggressively in your letters. Do you not fear for our safety? Because even if they were to come and do something against my family, they can easily have us move out of our house, because even though our house is our own, we've paid for it and everything, the land belongs to our traditional leaders, and that those are chiefs, alib, and if they are offended and you've offended them, then they can tell you to move out and you would have no right to say anything about it. So there was big concerns about that, and I kept going forward with it because I said, but it is the truth. And this is the reality that we are facing. And when these things are affecting my future, it is not just mine, but it's my family's future and my community's future that is being affected. And if nobody is going to stand up for us, then who will? And what really pushed me as well was reading the book. I am an avid reader. A book that I would recommend is Don't Ever Whisper by Giv Johnson. And it is a biography of a nuclear activist from our country, Darlene Keju. And she was mentoring a group of Marshallese youth, and she asked one of the young girls to pray. And the young girl she prayed, but she was praying very quietly. And so she interrupted her in the middle of her prayer and said, does anybody hear her? Can you hear her? And people were like, oh, she's speaking very quietly. And so she turns to the girl and then asks, do you hear this? Nobody can hear you right now. If you don't speak up, how will we know how to respond to your concern? how will we know what to do in order to alleviate what is burdening you right now? And for whatever reason, I think because this was coming from an elder in a society where my elders often discourage me from speaking up, that was the moment for me and the switch. And I said, okay, I will never not whisper from now on. I will only be louder from here on. And that's pushed me to be in spaces like this, attending the COP as the youngest delegation at 18 back in 2015 in Paris here. And I shall... Okay, a whole minute. And then using the gift of storytelling, poetry as a way to do spoken word performances that I found really, really empowering in addressing my climate anxiety and the emotional burden that comes with this job, but also reminding myself that I need to be grounded in the cause for my people and what the reason that I'm in this space for. So it is what keeps me going. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the question. Thanks everyone for staying. In terms of, pragmatism versus optimism, it's such a big question. We've already talked about climate anxiety today, which is something a lot of us feel. And I think my way of dealing with it in my background has been tackling smaller battles, which incrementally add up to take action on climate change. So before coming to Sciences Po, I was in my home country, Australia, working for the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Environment as a chickpea breeder. And so what we would do is, through science and research, we would find varieties of chickpeas and pulse crops that we thought would do well crossbreeding together, and we would crossbreed them to create varieties that had better yield, better adaptability, better results for farmers, but also that use less water, that can grow in drier climates, and that use less chemicals as well. So sort of working towards sustainable agriculture. But if you look at it from the big picture, that's me working on one kind of seed in one kind of domain in agriculture, which is one small part of the climate crisis. So, in terms of being completely nihilistic or completely naive, I think for me it just helps to tackle what I can tackle, which is this, smaller incremental battles. And then to bring the discussion back to environmental defenders, I'd like to talk about some researchers who are doing work very similar to what I was doing with my team in Australia. This team was in Ethiopia, and what we see in Ethiopia in the past few years is a terrible gall, which is a kind of disease that we can find in crops. This gall is in fava bean crops in Ethiopia. And so what researchers in Ethiopia and across a lot of the world have done to try and counteract this goal is diagnose the problem, diagnose the disease, and then start workshopping solutions. So that might be crossbreeding new varieties that can resist the gall and the disease, or it might be finding solutions to the midges and the bugs that spread the disease from plant to plant. And so this project was going really well for a number of years. And we saw good results. We diagnosed the problem, this team in Ethiopia. And then in October of 2023, 11 of the scientists and researchers and PhD students went out to do some fieldwork in the highlands and were kidnapped by rebels. These 11 people have not been seen since. Their families have paid ransoms, but they are missing, and some of them are believed to be dead. And so the results of this are that the research has come to a stop. The institutional knowledge in Ethiopia, the local expertise, the specialization in Ethiopia has ended because these people are missing, that knowledge is missing. And so, in a sense, we're more or less back to square one. And so, when facing massive issues like this of how do we protect environmental defenders, these researchers and scientists who are incrementally working towards sustainable agriculture, sustainable future, climate action, how do we protect them? Again, it's a question of working with the incremental, taking problems that we can solve first before trying to solve war or instability or famine. So yeah, I think maybe that makes me more pragmatic, trying to tackle the smaller issue before the massive ideological one. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
As an activist, I think one of the big questions that we constantly have to address is to what extent are we allowed to simplify our messages, because that's obviously essential to get to be heard, and when are we oversimplifying and it becomes dangerous. And I think one person to obviously look to in all of this, the person that has done climate change communication most effectively in the past decade, which is obviously Greta Thunberg, who for the first time in my life managed to move climate change to the top of the political agenda in many countries for several months. And she was obviously extremely good at sharing very simple, very clear messages, never concerned with sort of complex trade-offs of how do we address climate change while keeping jobs in Europe, or whatever those questions are that we have to ask. And we had similar discussions, or a lot of these discussions, in our own work at Plant for the Planet. We've been calling for many years for global forest ecosystem restoration. But of course, calling for 900 million hectares of forest to be restored is not something that's particularly catchy and that people understand. So we and other NGOs have simplified this substantially to talking about planting 1 trillion trees, which is a lot easier to explain and to put on a poster. But as this caught on a couple of years ago, with increasing support for this, there's also increasing criticism, right? With restoration ecologists justified in saying that, of course, it's not quite that simple. Tree planting is just one of a range of restoration methods that we need to use. We obviously need to look very specifically at all these ecosystems we're restoring and so on, which is all absolutely correct, but also harder to put on a poster. Now, if we had been more pragmatic, closer to policy in the way we communicated, we would have obviously been a lot less effective, but the things we would have said were obviously a bit closer to the truth, or what we actually need to do. So this is a really difficult trade-off. But at the same time, I think we're also seeing this at youth activism in the international climate space. In the late aughts and early teens, there's a lot of activism, a lot of youth that called on the UNFCCC, the COP climate process, to integrate youth better in the process and to have youth voices represented. And that activism was actually quite successful. And I think in the past decade, there's probably no lobby group or no interest group as well represented at the UNFCCC process, at the COP conferences, than youth activists. But I think increasingly we're sort of getting a bit of a bad reputation there, because a lot of this youth activism there isn't quite close enough to the policy, and then a lot of the things that youth are sometimes campaigning for in that context isn't really taken that seriously anymore, and these voices that are very, very represented aren't close enough to the policy to be taken seriously. So I guess it's a very hard balance that I struggle with a lot, and that we have sort of gone back and forth a bit over the years, but are increasingly shifting closer to the policy side than the good slogan side of things.
You have a whole minute.
Oh, well, those are all the smart things I know, or I'll pass this on to you.
You have an extra minute if he's gifting you.
No, thank you, Ben. At the UN, we have a rule and a practice, which is then when time is over, then they cut the microphone. So there's a good practice that you could also try and implement here at Sciences Po. So, starting with the good examples that you gave on Michel Bachelet and José Ramos Horta, I would say that I know them, and they're good examples of those who are moved and driven by passion at the beginning, and facing empirism, in fact, pragmatism. Michel was imprisoned, she faced torture, is enforced discipline in Chile, and then she became the head of state, and then she became the chief of UN Women, and at that time also had to face also pragmatism of the rules that we have to apply at the UN. José Ramos Horta himself was a political activist, in fact. He was also imprisoned, and then he became head of state of Timor-Leste, and then again he has to face also the pragmatism of the position that has to do politics, in fact, and to deal with also big states and big interests. On my part, I mean, if I'm trying to remind of when I was moved by or driven by passion, that's precisely when I was young at the time. I decided to leave the public service to take up the position of director of Amnesty International. In fact, I was driven by passion. In fact, human rights, that was my thing. And didn't look very much into the implication of leaving the public service to move to an NGO. But it was for me a sort of opening to other paths, in fact. And then I moved to the UN, to UNESCO, had the possibility to have those very beautiful mandate on the protection of defenders, and now this very new mandate. Hopefully we'll have time to discuss on working methods on the protection of environmental defenders. So yes, moved by passion, but also facing at each and every time empirism and pragmatism. I would say that, in fact, if I'm looking back into what I've been doing, I would say that, and in very simple words, and still the case now, passion is my driver, and pragmatism is my working method, in fact. And I'm always moved by passion while trying to, like for instance, with this new mandate, to expand or to explore what I'm calling the boundaries of the mandate. This is a mandate that's been created by the UN with a resolution which is binding for states, binding for me as well. But it's a new mandate, a new opportunity. And my passion is now to expand as much as possible the boundary, maybe to sometimes overlap the boundaries of the mandate to make it more effective for the protection of defenders. The last point, because I know that I have already 2 minutes. No? My current passion is precisely within this mandate, traveling around Europe since a couple of months, having met with governments to look for political support for my mandate. And each and every country, I also met with young people, young climate activists that are, as you know, gluing themselves on the floor, trying to block an access to airport or a road, using a slow march as a form of action, and that, in fact, using new forms of mobilization to use the right to protest and freely assemble, non-violent right to protest, in fact. And see that in many countries, like in France, in Germany, in UK, also in Spain, Portugal, Italy, everywhere in Europe, a part of Norway, they are facing the same pattern of repression. First by the police, using very violent forms to arrest those people and to lead them to prison. Like in Germany, this pain grief, which is very painful. You see that on videos. People are crying, in fact, so painful it is. That's a torture for me. And then being facing the justice system of the countries. You see that in UK, one of them has been sentenced to almost 3 years prison simply for blocking an access to a bridge. Recently, for slow march, an activist, 6 months prison, in fact. A judge in UK preventing the lawyer simply to use the word climate. And the guy used the word climate, and he was sentenced for contempt of court. So you see more and more repression in Europe on climate activists, and I'm trying to use my pragmatism, that is to mobilize all instruments from the international human rights law, precisely to show that states that is another way to approach those who are trying to protect our planet, simply by raising awareness on the fact that our governments are not doing enough to implement the Paris Agreement.
Lovely. Just under 5. Thank you, Michel. So what, you have heard each other. Thanks, Felix. You have heard each other. Would you like to question each other? In fact, push each other a little bit more, rather than being very nice and agreeing with everything. So who'd like to have a first go? On anything? Sure, Elena.
Michel, I would like to ask you a question. So the UN has quite a broad definition of what constitutes an environmental defender. It can be anyone who's defending human rights that pertain to the environment. So that can include climate activists or people engaging in slow marches and protests like you've been talking about. Or it can also include the scientists in Ethiopia that I was talking about as well. But do you think that, on the other hand, the broadness of the definition could work against its effectiveness?
I would say that the broadness of the definition, which has been, in fact, enshrined in the UN Declaration on Universal Defenders, and then in a report that I wrote in 2016, precisely on environmental defenders, that protects defenders, in fact, to have a broad definition. That is, anyone that pretends to protect the planet or to protect the environment or to fight for the rights to a healthy environment, that's a defender. And those people are entitled to seek protection from the UN. And then we are using all the working methods of the UN to protect those people and to raise awareness on state, but also on companies that they are doing harm to defenders and to our planet. So that's a good, to keep this very broad definition, for me, is a very precious tool. Because I see that currently, not only China, not only Venezuela, not only Russia and other countries are trying to defeat this UN definition. But what we see in Europe, in France, in Germany, in UK, is that public officials, ministers, members of parliament are using horrible terms to vilify the activities of climate activists, calling them eco-terrorists, while forgetting who is a terrorist, in fact, calling them green Talibans, forgetting what's happening in Afghanistan, and things like eco-zealots last week by the Prime Minister in UK. And my concern is that using those words and launching campaigns of vilifications, which is very well supported by mainstream media, like the Daily Mail in UK, other newspapers in Germany, elsewhere, that's also a way also to defeat those who are trying precisely to raise their voice for a cause. And it's not only the people who are facing those horrible words, but also the cause itself, which is defamed by public voices. And in my last call to UK, which is public, available on the website, you will see there's a call to politicians to refrain from those horrible terms that are defaming for the cause and for the young people who are trying to defend our planet.
Anyone else would like to question Felix?
I actually have a question for you, you as well.
Target hand like that. Okay, go on.
I think just one more, right? Yeah.
I don't feel threatened by you.
Okay, it seems a little harsh. I think a lot of the influence, the power of your office comes from the public attention that you can marshal for these people you're trying to protect. But obviously your office has only existed for a year. I unfortunately only heard about it after I got the invitation to this panel. And I don't know how much that's the case for other people here, but you obviously...
He's the last person in the room to hear of this. He's too busy planting trees, you know.
Have you guys been knowing about this? Is it just me? Okay, right. What's your plan to fix that outside this room?
I mean, that's true. I mean, if I would ask who knows the Aarhus Convention so far, who knows that a mandate has been created to protect environmental defenders, I'm pretty sure that many of you would not know, and even myself, I must say, although I'm very often in Geneva, and the mandate is based in Geneva, I was only informed by NGO that a new mandate has been created to the protection of environmental defenders. And they came to me saying, would you like to run for this mandate? And I do think that one of my current activity is to raise awareness on the fact that there is a new mandate that has been created precisely to protect those who are currently at risk, but also to raise awareness on the states on how to find measures to prevent the attacks to occur. Because protection is good, but prevention is more effective to make sure that those would not be targeted. And now I'm trying to promote the work methods. There's a website, and the promotion of the mandate. Look at my website. You would find all information. You would find the vision I have for the mandate. You would find the working methods. You would find some examples on how effective it has already been with companies that are targeting defenders, but also some states that are currently targeting, and that have a duty to respond Why? I'm finishing with that, because this mandate, contrary to other UN mandates, has been established within what we call a legally binding instrument. And you know what this means? That means that states have an obligation to implement all provisions of this Aarhus Convention on which my mandate has been based. So a lot of not only soft power, but legal power to enforce my recommendations to states and companies. We'll see the results. I'm optimistic.
To ask a question to the three of you. There has been a tendency when we talk about environmental defenders for issues of climate to dominate. But in many parts of the global south, and certainly some parts of the global north, environment is more than just climate. Climate is very important, climate change, climate variability. In many parts of the global south, it just becomes access to assets, of livelihood assets, of land, of issues of government, eminent domain, taking over property of especially of the marginalized poorer communities. It's happened in many parts of the Brazilian Amazon, always kind of talking about national issues. And same thing has happened in many other parts. So that opens up the possibility of making common cause with other defenders of rights, of political rights, of social rights, of land rights. So what do you see of that? Do you see that as some way diluting what you do? Because there is it is important to be kind of laser focused so people will hear you, you can very clearly communicate, but there's also the danger of kind of falling into a silo. So how do you deal with that, and what's your kind of, what are your thoughts on that? Beginning with Selena?
Yes. So I think this goes into the intersectionality of all the issues that we are facing, the social issues, and it's so important to, I think we all understand and know that the people who are most affected are the ones that are marginalized, and not only are they affected by the climate crisis, but there are also so many other social issues that are having an impact on their life. And so when this happens, then they can be dismissive and think that, oh, climate change is completely separate than the issue that I'm facing right now, therefore I need to focus just on that. But if we break down the barriers and then going to explain the connections that all these issues have together, then that'll definitely bring in people to understand that it's not all separate issues, it's all, they are all interlinked into one issue that we all need to tackle. There's just many different ways and many different avenues to go into that. And so it's definitely important that we don't separate these things and looking at it from a point of interconnectedness and ensuring that there's transparency between all the different areas so that they can share their findings and then how to better approach it.
I think I completely agree with what you're saying there. I think issues around climate and environment are often seen as young people's issues, which is obviously not the case. It's a public good, it's a shared thing, the environment, so it affects everybody. And when we see the intersectionality that you're talking about, then it becomes clear that it's not just a young people's issue, it becomes also an indigenous people's issue, and an issue in the global south, and an issue of economy and development. And so I think the intersectionality is really a strength in broadening the response, and also in ensuring that we get taken seriously as climate activists. And like at the conferences that you mentioned earlier. And yes, I see it as a strength.
Am I the third one in the three?
Yes, and then Michel.
Okay. Would you summarize in your question something that it took me a very long time to learn? When we're very focused on forest restoration for a long time as an NGO, and still are, but we initially focused very much on trying to convince governments to do forest restoration. But more and more research came out that showed that these these top-down forest restoration approaches often fail in the long run, right? They work wonderfully well at the beginning. These trees are planted or whatever restoration method is being applied, but 5, 10, 20 years down the line, these forests no longer exist because there was not adequate understanding of local processes on this land and local other land interests. And what they instead found is that what's broadly summarized as community-led restoration efforts, and I know you're going to judge me for using that term in that context. We had a good fun. So obviously it's super fuzzy, but projects led by people that live very close to where these trees are planted or these forests are restored generally have a much better track record at making sure that these forests still exist 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So we've reshifted a big part of our work at Plant for the Planet a few years ago to specifically focus on trying to support these community-led restoration efforts by helping them fundraise, by helping them with software tools to monitor their forests, by helping with ecological advice to do this well. Because one of the big challenges these efforts often do have is that they have the local knowledge, but not necessarily the environmental expertise. But that's the part that's usually much easier to fix. And I think the other really important part that you mentioned is obviously the biodiversity perspective. I came into doing this because I cared about climate change. That's the motivation behind our work. And we've, over the years, I became a biologist, I studied ecology, and became much more passionate about addressing the biodiversity challenges. In our public communication, we still focus very narrowly on talking about forests as addressing climate change, because that sells better, that's what gets us the funding to be able to do this work. But of course, behind the scenes, protecting biodiversity is just as important for us. In our project Mexico, we plant 41 different species to make sure that we can restore this local ecosystem as well as possible.
You were right to say that environmental defense is not only climate activists. That's very broad. And when we started this panel, we heard the data coming from the report by Global Witness, and we invite you to also look into this report by Global Witness, and you would see that in the world, 80% of those who are killed, 80% of the 200 who are killed, and probably that's only the a part of the data, are in fact environmental defenders. Killed for their action, for defending their land, their environment, their community, their cosmovision for some of them. And that's the case in Colombia, that's the case in Mexico, in other countries in Latin America, in the Philippines as well, in Asia. But of course, environmental defenders would include also those who are trying to fight for climate. Why? Because we see the impact of rights everywhere in the world. Look at the images that you see on your screen on Pakistan, for instance, the flood since 2-3 years now, no food for kids in Pakistan because of the climate change. In Africa, so many people are obliged to flee their country because they nothing to eat, no water anymore. So that climate has an impact on the full enjoyment of our rights. My concern is that, in fact, when you speak with NGOs and those who are working on human rights, you see that there is, in fact, there are big NGOs working in silos, in fact. Those who are working on climate and environment don't really know those who are working on human rights. And similarly, those who are working on human rights only know climate activists when they are in danger and try to protect them. But there's no connection, no mainstream work. And we need to promote a better interaction between the 2 and 3 categories of defenders. They all are defenders according to the UN and need to be protected as such.
We are ready to hear your fabulous questions now, if you can line up behind. In the meanwhile, we can have people disagree. They have not been disagreeing at all. This is a very boring. You guys should really disagree. Now, why don't we start with the chap with the jacket? Yep. Please introduce yourself and then keep your questions a tad brief.
Okay.
Lovely.
Thank you. So my name is Domen. I study environmental policy here at PSIA. I have a question for the panel about environmental defenders defending themselves. For example, we've seen throughout history that when peaceful protests for people's rights are squashed willy-nilly by the authorities, people tend to take up a more radical, violent approach to protect their rights. For example, Spear of the Nation in South Africa or Black Panthers in the US. And yeah, with environmental defenders being harassed at every turn, being arrested, being murdered, do you foresee them sort of radicalizing their approach in terms of their protest actions, but also in terms of radicalizing their tactics to protect themselves? And do you consider that to be a viable approach? Or would that cause an even bigger problem in terms of possible civil unrest or the public, the wider public, turning against the environmental agenda?
Thank you. We have one more. Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I'm Muriel, I'm also studying environmental policy, and I have the question, in the past years and also in research, we've seen that there's a division between people who either think it's very urgent to act on the climate crisis, or who believe it's already too late, or who don't believe in climate change or the human-made climate change at all. And I'm asking myself what you have learned from your own experience or from research, how we can become more strategic in actually communicating the climate crisis, and yes, having an approach to actually convince people how urgent action is, whether it's voters to vote for the parties, or whether it's people in the positions themselves. Thank you.
Okay, so two questions. Environmental defenders taking up guns, and the second is more effective communication. So who'd like to take up either of them? Okay.
I could start, yes, precisely. That's a big issue for the mandate, a big issue for the UN, because we have a clause at the UN on violence, in fact. Article 1 of the UN Declaration on Defenders states that, as I said, any individual group and organ of society who are simply promoting and protecting the rights are defenders, provided that they don't use violence. And we are very much discussing with the UN what it means violence. It's mostly violence against the persons, in fact. When you are using, throwing cocktail molotovs or things like, you are violent, you are not defender, and you are not eligible to protection by the UN. Now, when it comes to violence against goods, properties, that's very different. And that's why currently I'm going to publish in the coming weeks a position paper on what we call civil disobedience, in fact. Because civil disobedience is covered by international humanitarian law. And precisely, it states that a certain form of disruption of daily life is protected, which is something that states will ignore. But at the same time, I would agree that many young people, and not so more young people, are desperate now and say that the current forms of mobilizations are not useful anymore, and we need to move to other forms, and they are using in form like sabotage or violent action against goods. And you may know the famous book, How to Blow a Pipeline, for instance. That's a good example. I invite you to read this book. Not apology for blowing pipelines, but that's a very good book. So that's something which is very much at the heart of our discussion now. So I don't believe in violence. I don't believe in those forms of violence, but I'm supporting and defend those who are trying to use forms of mobilization like civil disobedience and sometimes are attacking private goods or properties to raise awareness and to raise their voice on the need to do more on climate.
I think I'd like to say something to the second question on raising awareness and even with climate change denial. I think, again, we can talk about the power of intersectionality. So in my line of work, we are working towards sustainable agriculture, which is an action for a better climate, but it's also an action towards food security. And it is very hard to deny the fact that many, many countries do not have food security at the moment. So if we can make it an issue of framing, if we can frame our work as working towards food security and good distribution and better availability of good food and nutrition, then that can sort of circumvent the issue of climate denial, even though our work still is moving towards sustainable practices.
I'll just really quickly jump in on that second question as well. I think I've given up on trying to convince climate deniers a long time ago because I don't think that's the there are not that many of them, thank God, and it's really, really hard. But I think it is really important that we convince the ones that have given up on climate change being solvable. And I think the most effective thing we can do there is share good news about the progress we are making. Obviously, broadly, generally, we're not making nearly fast enough progress in addressing the climate crisis. But in a lot of smaller things, we're making substantial progress. We discussed in our breakout group earlier today the massive progress we've made in recent decades in reducing deforestation. We only lose about a third as much forest now as we did at its peak in the 80s. That's not enough, but really important, valuable progress in the right direction. And obviously, our CO2 emissions are still rising every year, but the key technologies we need for a zero emissions future have become radically cheaper over recent decades, and therefore addressing climate change is much, much cheaper now than it has been at any point in history, and it actually makes solving this problem much more realistic now than I would have imagined 10 years ago.
Okay, so hold your fire for the rest of the others. We have a long and eager beavers here. Go on.
Okay. Hello, thank you for your very interesting presentations. My name is Lucy. I'm in the Human Rights Master, and I would love to understand a bit more how practical mechanisms are in place or could be in place to better protect environmental defenders, not only from the threats that they receive from sometimes their own governments, but by non-governmental actors. And if there are funds that are allocated for that. I'm specifically thinking about, for example, Colombia, where indigenous leaders are usually at risk for many, many reasons. And locally, there are a lot of protection routes that are being in place to protect them, but they usually lack funding, and it's usually made from a very communitarian, community level protection routes. So I was wondering whether from the international level we had more funding to help those kind of protection routes everywhere. Thank you.
My name is Steven from Strathmore University, Kenya. I study Masters in Philosophy and Ethics. I'll be here for one semester. My question is to Felix. Do you offer, for the community-led projects, do you offer seeds to the community? Because I know from my country, there are some, but which you never know who is given. But I know some people who will be willing to participate. I don't know whether you can as well offer that to Africa as well. If yes, then I would like to know more. Thank you.
Okay, they seem to have worked it out. Both are about resources. What do you do about resources for environmental defenders and to plant trees and so on? Who would like to pick this up?
Maybe on the mechanism, that's a very broad issue. I remember in 1998, when the UN Declaration was adopted, there was quasi no funding for defenders because the concept of defenders was not very, very popular. There were funds for NGOs, but nothing for defenders. But since then, a lot of things have been done, in fact. A lot of mechanisms have been developed. First, starting with the UN, where they have created a mandate of special rapporteur on defenders as a whole, and I was the third incumbent of this mandate, with a lot of impact and power on state and companies to enforce the obligations of states. The EU as well has developed its own mechanism, providing millions of euros every year, not only to NGOs, but also to local mechanisms. And in many countries, you mentioned Colombia, there is a state-owned mechanism to protect defenders, spending almost $500,000 a year to protect defenders by any means. That is a bulletproof jacket, armed guard, bodyguards, panic buttons to protect those defenders. And you see the effectiveness of those mechanisms. Of course, because environmental defenders are the most at risk. There's a new mandate at the UN, and as I said, this mandate has new powers, and I need to demonstrate the effectiveness of this mandate. But believe me, since 30 years, a lot has been done. Big foundations are now devoting their funds to provide funding. Another means, which is very effective to protect defenders, is relocation. When you see that in Uganda or in Colombia, defenders are at risk to be killed, then now the EU has the possibility within 24 hours to relocate the person and his family, her family, to another place to make sure that at least they would not be killed by the perpetrators. So in countries like in France, Germany, UK and other countries, Spain, there is what we call the shelter mechanism, by which a municipality would host a group of defenders for like 18 months, providing security, food, healthcare, things alike, to protect defenders. So I don't have time to go into all mechanisms, but believe me, a lot has been done. At the same time, things are getting worse, and you see more and more killings on defenders, more and more attacks against defenders, more campaigns of vilifications and defamation against those defenders. So that's why we need to increase and provide additional funding to those who are in the regions on the ground, protecting physically those who are at risk.
Planting those trees with the right seeds is incredibly important, right? If we want to protect the local biodiversity, it's essential that we plant exclusively endemic local species in these restoration projects. But that also requires that the seeds that you grow your seedlings from are immediately from the vicinity that you're working in. There's this rule of thumb that the seeds shouldn't be collected more than 50 or 100 kilometers away from the location where you plant these trees. That's why we as an NGO that works like sort of across the tropics can't really provide seeds for everyone everywhere. If you're lucky, in the place you're working at, there might be a government seed bank that might be able to support you with this. And if you reach out to the Plan for the Planet Restoration Advice Team, they might be able to help you find that. If not, it's not that hard to start your own seed collection program. And we're happy to help and advise how that works as well. Basically, you just need to know when each tree species distributes its seeds, the right time of the year, and then sort of map a few mother trees in your local vicinity, and then you just collect those seeds. It's very doable.
Question, sorry, no money, but we'll give you plenty of advice. Okay.
May I?
Oh, sure.
Yes, sorry. I apologize for doing this. I didn't have the chance, but I had answers to the first two questions. So on radicalizing and violence towards environmental defenders, I think it's really important that we understand or what constitutes as violence. I think we are here in this climate crisis because of the extraction of natural resources from the environment. And so in these extraction, that meant a lot of violence was committed towards the people of these lands. And when it is talked about by media and the rest of the world, that is seen as development and progress. And then when these environmental defenders who have been seeing the atrocity committed to their lands, now they're standing up for themselves and then wanting to get the attention, then that is receiving more condemnation than the atrocities that has been committed by bigger nations and the institutions that are allowing these things to happen. And so there's less accountability and repercussions that is being delegated onto them. And for the final question on division, just an example from the Marshall Islands, even though we are in the front line, we still have climate deniers. And it's very important to understand and utilize the different knowledges that we have. And so one of our biggest groups of climate deniers is our folks from the Christian community, because they are understanding what is happening. Their understanding of the sea level rising, the droughts, and all the other things that are happening is that in the book of Revelation, the world, all of these things that are happening right now, it means the end of the world is coming. And that's how they're understanding the climate crisis. And so we are going into them, we are going and having consultations with them, not bringing in the climate science and saying, oh, you have to understand the data and the number, this is actually what is happening, but going with them and speaking to them within their language. And so talking with them about Bible verses. Oh, why did God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Was it to destroy it or to protect it? And then their answer is to protect it. And so then you bring that back to us. So why is God putting us on this? Why did he put us on this planet? And so their answers is, oh, so that we can protect this Garden of Eden of ours. And so that they are able to respond. And then they look at what they can do and actions that they've done so far. And that is how we communicate with them and get them onto doing this work that is very important. So we should not be dismissive of the other areas of knowledge there is. Thank you.
Sorry, in the interest of time,
Yep.
we'll take all 4 questions.
Well, hello, my name is Federico. I'm part of the PSIA team. I'm also an ex-Sciences student, and I'm also an environmental activist. I'm from Mexico, particularly from a city called Querétaro in central Mexico. And there, along with my environmental colleagues, we found a problem. We do mainly biodiversity protection around urban areas, and we encountered this problem in which one of my friends was threatened because her personal number, her address, and all her personal data was released by an authority, supposed to be an environmental authority, local authority, and her life was threatened because of this, because obviously people she denounced got this information, and then now people that can damage her know where she lives. So knowing this, we also got to reach for the Escazú agreement that is in Latin America, and we wanted to make it legally binding. And we found the problem on how to get the Escazú agreement into a local environment and into a local government, and how to actually put this mechanism into action, to actually work. And that's where the problem is. I'm so glad to hear like this new office is there for environmental defenders, but sometimes we feel like we're unable to reach these big international legal instruments that are there for us. But how do we bring them to a local level to actually work?
All right.
So, thank you.
And hello, my name is Veronica, and I'm in the Master of Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. Thank you for being here and sharing your insights. My question is for all of you. So I just completed my internship at the UN in peace building, and something that they often said was making the business case for peace and peace building. And I'm wondering, in your experience, have you seen examples of it, or do you think that this business case is a viable solution? There are many scientists who are doing amazing work, but they're maybe underfunded or are being threatened. And I'm wondering, again, my question is, do you think that this is a feasible case in order to create synergy between states and companies and then those defending the environment? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Deborah. I'm an exchange student here. I'm from Brazil. And even though I could say a lot of things about defenders in Brazil, human rights, and environmentalists, my question regards another one that was just said. Even though we have those programs and they fail to protect those people, my point is that nowadays we have this problem with politicians worldwide, not only in Brazil, but we have these movements towards right and the politicians, and most of them are they are mainly they deny that we have this climate crisis. And I was so happy for Felix when you said that you don't know many of them, but I do a lot. And they are like, they just don't believe it exists and it's happening now. And how do you see that there is a possibility to make those mechanisms to exist, even though we have this change in politics? If that's a possibility, how to put it together?
Hi, I'm Caroline. I study diplomacy, and thank you for today. I really appreciate that you mentioned the broad definition of environmental defenders, as well as intersectionality and your dislike for violence. My question is, how are you supporting the activists in Gaza currently? As I'm sure we can all agree, bombs are not environmentally friendly. So, thank you.
Right, I might tackle the business case question, which is a great question.
By the way, we have 9 more minutes.
All right, thanks, Shiv. Okay, I'll make it quick. I think there's always a business case with climate and environment because it's so intertwined all the time. In my case, from my experience, the business case is that crop breeding is good for farmers, which means since agriculture is a very big part of the Australian economy, it's good for our economy, and that's good for everyone. So better seeds and more environmentally friendly and sustainable seeds means better yield for the farmers. They can spend less on fertilizers and water and disease prevention. And this also applies in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, I think, agriculture employs over 80% of the population. And it's also a question there of securing food supply, of having food security. So the business case there is that if there is agriculture, if there's sustainable agriculture, then that's better employment, more stable employment for everyone. That's better for the economy of the entire country. So yeah, business case, always super important. And I think there is always one when it comes to the environment.
I'll take on the final question on supporting environmental defenders in Gaza. So the Marshall Islands was one of the countries that voted against a ceasefire when the UN called for that resolution. And they then had another vote recently, and then the Marshall Islands abstained. And so, as a country that's going into the environmental, the climate space, and then speaking about climate justice for all, and then voting against a ceasefire, that did not align with what we, as climate activists and people or defenders of our countries, are fighting for. And so one of our big climate activists, Kathy Kujinar, who's also the climate envoy for the Marshall Islands, she had written an op-ed criticizing the country, the RMI's vote in the UN ceasefire call, and then also was the many other youths in our country came forth and then called out our country for their for what they had done in this situation. And so now the country has been forced, and they have made a statement and said that they're looking into their policies right now to make sure that we have the autonomy to vote in the UN according to what aligns with the values that we fight for, because one of the influences of the vote, which is not to validate in any way why we said no to the ceasefire, but it's because of our relationship with the US, and anything the US votes for, our country is politically driven to vote for as well. And so right now, there is a lot of movement within the government to make changes for that. But if that criticism, if that voice and anger hadn't come from our big climate activists and then the rest of the youth, and then undermining the leadership of our role in the climate movement, then it really wouldn't have happened. But definitely, not being silent, calling out your country and your government, and the being aware of the decisions that they're making and the votes that they are involved in. It's very important.
No, it's too much.
Make it 3.
Okay, try to be quick. Again, to come back on the report by Global Witness, you would see that in many parts of the world, the most dangerous actors are not the states or security forces, but companies. So how to tackle the problem of the role of companies, and that's very complicated because you know that in Latin America, you mentioned Mexico, other countries, that's very easy. You pay like $10, $50, you find a sicario being able to kill anyone, any place, anywhere. But if you investigate in the chain of responsibility, the most complicated is to find the mastermind, in fact. And in all cases that I've seen, the mastermind as a sort of collusion between politicians, senators, ministers, and companies. So that's the problem that we have to face. Companies and politicians are linked. What I heard also is that in many countries, as the case for Mexico, also elsewhere, you don't decide to become an environmental defender. You become defender by necessity, out of a necessity, because your family has been threatened, your environment has been threatened, your farm has been attacked by companies, and then you decide to become a defender by necessity, and then you have to find out how to be protected and to look into all mechanisms to protect you. Sorry to focus on you, but on Mexico and Escazú, the good news, I'm traveling to Chile in a couple of weeks, precisely to meet with the Escazú agreement, to inform them on the impact of my mandate, which has been created within the Aarhus Convention, to inform them and to discuss with them the possibility to develop similar mechanisms for the protection of defenders in Latin America. Last point, if you allow me, I would like to disclose, with your permission, part of my next report for the student of Sciences Po, and give you a very brief definition of what I understand by civil disobedience, in fact. So I apply, in fact, 4 criteria for climate activists and those. The first is that it's an individual or a group that would decide to deliberately break the law. They know that breaking the law, and they are ready to face the justice, a fine, even a prison. So you are breaking a law, and you know that you are going to face the law. The second element is that it has to be public, not in our backyard, not in a room, because you want to draw the attention on a very broad injustice or a law that might hamper your life. It has to be, third criteria, non-violent. Again, I refer to what I said about violence. Violence would be agreed when it comes to disarmament of a pipeline, but not blowing a pipeline, for instance. And the last is that you have to do that for a cause that you want to abolish a law in your country, or you want to fight for a cause which is superior to what you see, and you are ready to face the implication of your law breaking to draw the attention on the fact that a law in the past or currently a system is not compatible with international human rights obligations. So that's part of my report. I invite you to read the report on the 20th of February, would be disclosed publicly in a press conference.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank all of you, an extremely disciplined audience. Not usually used to such discipline. Usually there is a lot of kind of chaos in the audience. But thank you for being so cooperative. And thank you very much for 4 wonderful speakers. And we wish we had another hour, but we already have dignitaries for the next panel already here. They're chomping at the bit. We want to let them have the stage. Lovely. Thank you again.
Thank you.